Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish and Ukrainian Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. When Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, we decided to open our platform to Ukrainian topics, both in Ukrainian literature itself, such as our episodes on Taras Shevchenko and Serhiy Zhadan, Ukrainian writers with a particular investment in Polish literature, such as our episodes on Yuri Andruchowicz and Żanna Słoniowska, and writing in Polish literature about Ukraine, such as our episode about Henryk Sienkiewicz and today's topic, the Ukrainian School in Polish Romanticism. We've also tried to highlight Ukrainian connections in our other episodes as they are difficult to avoid, given the deep connections between Polish and Ukrainian history. Of course, that history is marked by conflict and the traumas of war, serfdom, and massacres that can make for some difficult discussions. But in this time of genuine solidarity between Poland and Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, perhaps the trust now exists to heal those long, unresolved wounds. Before we meet today's guest, I'd like to thank everyone who has been following and supporting Encounters with Polish Literature, and remind you to click the thumbs up, ring the bell, subscribe, leave a comment to help the program reach more viewers by moving up in the search rankings. It turns out that by the time our last episode on Józef Czapski was posted, we finally did meet our goal of having more than 1,000 subscribers. Now, it's not PewDiePie or Mr. Beast, I know. But thanks to you folks, our viewers, we're making some progress. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do, so you can be informed about all the new episodes of Encounters with Polish Literature and the other programming from the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Roman Koropeckyj, who joined us in Season 2, Episode 3 to discuss the work of the Polish national poet, Adam Mickiewicz. He's a professor in the Department of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where he's been teaching since 1992. He received his BA in Comparative Literature at Columbia University in 1976 and his PhD in Slavic Language and Literatures at Harvard University in 1990. Koropeckyj is the author of 2 award-winning books on Adam Mickiewicz: The Poetics of Revitalization, Adam Mickiewicz Between Forefathers Eve Part 3 and Pan Tadeusz, published in 2001, and Adam Mickiewicz, The Life of a Romantic, published in 2008, translated into Polish in 2013, as well as many articles on Polish, Ukrainian, and Little Russian literatures. He is currently at work on a study about the life of 18th century Ukrainian bandit Semyon Harkusha and stories about him. Roman, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you here again.
And it's wonderful to be back again. I hope that we have just as good of a time this time as we did last time, and just as instructive.
I'm sure we will. Thanks so much. So the Ukrainian School in Polish Romanticism, give us what are the dates, who are the major figures, what critics came up with this idea that there is even something called a Ukrainian school?
The notion of looking at Polish literature of the first half of 19th century, Romanticism, the notion of looking at it in terms of geography, first was codified by a critic named Alexander Teshinsky in a novel, otherwise unremarkable novel called An American Lady in Poland. It was published in 1837. And what he did was he decided to categorize Polish literature of the time according to geographic regions, and each geographic region had a particular characteristic to it. There was a Lithuanian school, and he called them schools, szkoła, a Lithuanian school that was characterized by love, friendship, affability. And this, of course, had to do with Mickiewicz and all of his friends, the Philomaths and the Philarets. The next school that he talked about was the school of Puławy. That was the one that was around Prince Czartoryski. And this is the sentimentalist school, I guess. And he characterized it as being one characterized by affection and tenderness. Then he had a Krakowian school, which he characterized, in other words, Galicia, which he characterized with, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on, with a joyfulness, liveliness. And then finally, the one that really made it, the one that stuck, I would say, is what he called the Ukrainian School, which he characterized uh, with gloominess, wildness, bloody imagery, crimes. And to this school, he included four poets. First of all, Antoni Malczewski, the author of Maria, above all. Second, Józef Bohdan Zaleski, the author of a number of poems about Ukraine, influenced by Ukraine, inspired by Ukraine. Seweryn Goszczyński, who, above all, at that time, the author of other things, but above all, as the author of Zamek Koniowski, the Castle of Kaniów. And he included here as well Maurycy Gosławski, because he had written this long poem called about Podolia, which was a very, very important region for Poles throughout the 17th and 18th century. Tyszynski's categorization struck another very important critic as an important one. And this really is the person who kind of developed the whole notion of the Ukrainian school, and that's Michał Grabowski, who himself was the product of Ukraine, and who went to school in Umań, or Humań in Polish, with Goszczyński and Zaleski. They were so-called the Zagogra group. They went to the Basilian school in Umań, or Humań in Polish, famous, as we'll see, for the massacre that occurred there during the Hajdamach Rebellion in 1768. And he categorized these writers even further, calling Malczewski the poet of the gentry or of history, Zaleski the poet of the Cossacks, Goszczyński is the poet of the Hajdamachs, and then he added his own members of the Ukrainian school. First of all, he said Gosławski should not be a member of the Ukrainian school, but he added two minor poets, Tomasz August Olizarowski, who's above all the author, best known in terms of his Ukrainian material, of this poem called Zaverucha, and then also Alexander Groza, both a poet and a prose writer, the author of a number of other things, also relatively minor. Now, the point to remember is that already earlier, Grabowski had focused on the Ukrainian element in Polish literature. He had written articles or reviews on subjects such as the Ukrainian songs and their influence on Polish poetry, or in general, the Ukrainian element in Polish poetry, which we published, I think, a year earlier than this long article on the Ukrainian School of Poetry, which he published in 1840. And then he himself produced a number of not the best novels in the world, but interesting. I found them interesting, I think, that for a number of reasons. But in any case, usually based around the Hajdamach uprising. And this was the Hajdamach uprising in the steppes, Stanica Hułej-Polska, the camp around Hułej-Pole, the blizzard in the steppe, and one of the more notorious figures of the period, the governor of Kaniów, who pops up in a number of works by people who deal with this subject matter. And then finally, the third critic in 1843 that latched onto this and then added on a whole bunch of other geographical regions was the leftist Hegelian critic Edward Dębowski from Galicia, who in his thoughts on the development of our literature in the 19th century also used Tyszynski's categorization according to geographic regions. Now, one other thing that's important to point out, too, is that the leading Romantic critic, probably the best Romantic critic, Maurycy Mochnacki, already before the 1830 uprising, already in reviews of Maria on the one hand and of Zamek Koniowski, the Castle in Kaniów, Goszczyński, had pointed out to the importance of the Ukrainian theme in the beginnings of Romantic literature in Poland. And this is something that I think is very important to remember, is that Romanticism in general is a product of the so-called Kresy, the borderlands, right? Either be it Lithuania, obviously Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, whereas the capital, the Congress Kingdom before 1830, was still very much the province of the neoclassicist writers, the writers who still looked backwards, and as a matter of fact, were nemesis of this whole new fad that they called Romanticism. So, remember that this was where the king was, at the capital of Poland, and so forth. And there was a tendency to be more conservative in that part of Poland. So it's important to remember that Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus, they were forges in which Polish Romanticism developed in this period.
It seems to me like, I was sort of looking at how the Ukrainian school is covered, since, I don't work mainly, I work mainly on the 20th century, so it's not exactly my territory. But it seems like, oh yes, this is something we know about in the field of Polish studies, but unless you're a specialist in Romanticism, you might not have a lot of contact with it. Looking back at the earlier histories in English, Creedle devotes maybe about 6 pages maybe to the Ukrainian school, and then by the time you get to Miłosz, it's Miłosz's history, it's maybe about 3 pages. And if you look at the recent collection of essays on the history of Polish literature published as Being Poland, which we discussed in our first episode of Encounters with Polish Literature, you get kind of like a box where you get a little mention of the Ukrainian school. But now, I think with obviously with the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of new focus on Ukraine in Polish literature. So, do you think that that it's time for a reassessment, a time for understanding the Ukrainian school in some new way?
I wouldn't quite agree with what people are saying, and the historians and so forth. There is at least one writer in the Ukrainian school that has grown constantly in terms of his reputation and the depth of what he wrote and interpretive exegetic possibilities of his text, and that's Malczewski's Maria. Mm-hmm. And particularly for the scholars of Romanticism of my generation, this was the text. Everybody wrote something about it. And I remember when I went to Poland after a long, long hiatus, I went for a conference for Mieszkowicz's 100th anniversary in 1998. And I ran into all of these people for the first time. All of these are essentially my contemporaries. They were all students of Maria Janjon. And they were testing me out, and they asked me, "Well, what's your favorite work in Polish Romanticism?" And my first reaction was Maria by Mieszkowski, and that was it. I was their friend for life. It really is a text that has been written a lot in my generation and in other generations. Just as 19th century writers' reputations obviously have gone through their ups and downs. The most popular, for instance, of the so-called Ukrainian school was Bogdan Zaleski at that time, who was viewed as the nightingale of Ukraine, the poet of Ukraine, who really embodied Ukraine. Well, I would say his reputation has taken a serious plummet. His poetry is, in my opinion, practically unreadable now because of his attempt at the syllabatonic versification. We can talk about that later.
The sing-song rhythm.
Yeah, these sing-song rhythms. Yeah, exactly. You go into a trance after a while. Whereas, with really very little content, I must add. And Goszczyński, I think his reputation has remained relatively constant, particularly in the 1950s. Remember that Goszczyński, for a period of time, before he became a Tauvianist, for a period of time was a Polish. He took part in the 1830 uprising. He was one of the people that attacked the Belvedere. After that, he became a very progressive leftist conspirator. Some of Maria Janina's earliest works were about Gościński and the revolution. Communist literary critics of the 1950s really, latched on to Gościński, particularly The Castle in Kaniów, because of its certain class undertones, right?
It's about a peasant uprising. So
exactly. Let's be careful. Not peasants. It's about a Cossack uprising.
A Cossack uprising.
Yeah, that's
okay.
A little
Fair
different. But it certainly has its social, and at least the way it was read in the 1950s, it certainly has its social implications. If one looks at all of the other writers that were associated with Ukraine, and when I was preparing for this, I made up this whole list of it. And if you think to yourself that the number of writers, number of works that were produced about dealing with Ukraine, this is a topic almost as important as Poland itself, and for obvious reasons. But some of those writers have fallen from favor. Others have been rediscovered. But again, getting back to the original trio, right? Mieszkowski, Gościński, and Zalewski. Mieszkowski has remained, really, people look at him as one of the truly, in a sense, one of the founders of Polish Romanticism. Remember that Maria was published in 1825, before the uprising, and it was the first genuinely Byronic work, more so even than Konrad Wallenrod, I would argue. So it was an extremely important text for Polish literature whenever.
So let's start with Mieszkowski. So who was Mieszkowski, and let's talk. Then we can talk about Maria.
Well, Mieszkowski was a product of Volhynia, right? He went to remember that there were two centers before the 1830 uprising, two important centers of education in Poland, in Vilnius, the university in Vilnius, and the collegium, I guess that's the word for it, in Kremenec, now Krzemieniec, then founded by Chotsky, of which a number of very famous writers came in. He was a product of this school in Krzemieniec. He participated in the various aspects of Napoleon adventure, but not quite, because before really getting into the action, he was shot in the foot during a duel. And then again, he hurt his foot when he was riding a horse, so he didn't really participate in the any battles. I seem to remember, and then there you go. You have the first parallel with Byron, right? He had a crippled foot, right? Like Byron had, he also hobbled. Mieszkowski also latched himself onto some very wealthy lady. This was pretty common in those days, and traveled around Europe with her. And what was interesting about him, and he writes about this in Maria in one of the long footnotes, is he was, as far as I know, the first Pole to climb Mount Blanc. And it was this, for the Romantics, being in the Alps, and then climbing Mount Blanc is like the supreme experience of the sublime, right? And he has this wonderful footnote where he talks about how being on top of Mount Blanc, you look down and you see how the world in its tiniest little aspects and how unimportant it all is, right? And there are rumors that when he was in Venice, he may have met Byron, but that's probably not true. But he was certainly very much influenced by Byron. And Maria is very much a Byronic poem, an attempt to write a Byronic poem in Polish, which that in itself makes it very interesting. But the most interesting thing about Mieszkowski, I think, is that he was a great acolyte or practitioner of mesmerism.
Yes, that also caught my eye.
Hypnosis. And he began an affair with a married woman who she felt he helped cure her neurasthenia, her hysteria, whatever you want to call it, with hypnosis. And he stuck with her. It became this horrific knot, this tangle between
Mm-hmm.
him and her, where she could not live without him, and he encouraged her and enabled her with this hypnosis. And why this is interesting, I mean, it really did ultimately, he died of cancer relatively young.
He was 33, wasn't he?
Yeah, the second part of his life was ruined by this relationship with her. But
Mm-hmm.
what is truly fascinating, and I think it directly impinges on or impacts the kind of poem that Maria is that after all, hypnosis was the first important entryway into a knowledge of the unconscious.
Right.
This was an early form of, psychoanalysis in its way.
Yes.
And it's clear throughout Maria that we are dealing with some very deep psychosexual imagery, structures, mysteries that make this poem, first of all, make this poem, of course, just a beautiful example of or object for psychoanalytic interpretation, which some people have done already. But at the same time, it gives us it gives the poem this uncanny, eerie atmosphere full of the death drive, of despair, of imagery, of the surface and the underground, all of these things permeating this poem. And I think precisely because of its origins in the experience of hypnotism, make this poem such a very interesting and such a very contemporary poem, and open to so many different interpretations, of which there have been many, many.
Maybe we could set it up before we try to read any sections. Like, what's the give our audience the plot summary?
Václav, the hero, falls in love with Václav, the hero, who is the son of a very wealthy magnate, falls in love with the daughter of a middling, not very wealthy gentryman, right? In other words, a mésalliance. Mm-hmm. And the father, Václav's father, at first refuses to countenance this marriage, and then seems to ostensibly allow it. And before he allows Václav to finally consummate to marry Maria, the heroine, he sends him out to battle with the Tatars, right? As I said, the poem takes place probably sometime. It's very difficult to tell because it's so mythologically invested. Probably sometime in the 17th century, let's say, although it's based on certain other stories that are of later, the 18th century. Maria, on the other hand, the heroine, is this strange, ethereal being who is really not of this earth. She's constantly talking that she is 1 foot in the grave, that she is about to die. That's all she wants to do is die. And here we can talk about, how this notion of how the death drive works and throughout this entire poem. Václav goes out with the father of Maria. They go fight the Tatars, and in the meantime, this strange crew of masked revelers having to do something with Venice come into the compound of Maria and her father, and while Václav is away, murder Maria. Okay, so in other words, these are people that have been sent by his father to get this way to prevent the marriage from occurring. Václav comes back, finds her dead body. I mean, it's an amazing scene of him walking in, seeing the window open, the doorway, so her bedroom open, the curtains, walking in, seeing her dead body. Really, there's some really remarkable passages in here.
Let's read that scene. That's a great scene. Would you like to read it?
Against the gate, the charger now leans his foaming breast and neighs and sniffs the air, its portent as if to test. But though the moon shines clearly, there is not a soul about, no yeoman who with eager foot comes running nimbly out. Ah well, 'tis late, so let them sleep, mused Václav as his hand was fastening his steed. Then warned by such a thought as caused his very heart to swoon, that it would beat upon his own beloved one's bosom soon, and bathe in brightness such as rises when new pleasures overpour old fears. The youth impatient stood before his dear one's door. The memory of old caresses sprang to sudden birth. Only a little while, and he shall be the happiest man on earth. In heaven, too, he knocks a second time and thrice. 3 times a watchful echo with hollow answer flies. Is silent then, the only sign of movement or of life, which drowsing there awaited the returning night. No hurrying steps, no burst of sudden cries, no light. All dark and quiet the tight-barred castle lies. How deep must be their slumber, impatience cannot wait. It counsels a single saber cut will open wide the gate. But from that inviting counsel Václav shook his impulse free to heighten her disquietude, that he might curb his own anxiety. So deaf and dead and quiet when his precious treasure lies, like some accursed castle that an Arab tale might rise. But what is that? When hope of getting in had almost died, he noticed something moving in a chamber at the side, saw a window open, over it a curtain light, hung there to guard the sleeper from prowlers of the night. It seems that fluttering curtain to scoff at the timid wind that pushes it outside the room and straightway draws it in. Oh, what fire is coursing through his nightly veins, what gleam of happiness his fair cheek stains. How to resist mad thoughts, how bid them all be gone. None could but model knight or stone, nor one nor other he, though in war a hero known, and true in love and grateful, he stands inside the room.
Right. What's going on here?
Notice the anxiety of the possibility of death mixed in with sexual desire here. It's absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Upon the bed that lay in order there before his eyes, her arms wide stretched above her head, the sleeping Maria lies. But comfort does not soothe her troubled rest. As if released from misery that long had pierced her breast, she seems the suffering still plain upon her livid face, and all her figure lying still as death within the dismal place. Her glowing curls are tossed in careless disarray. To charm one's lover, none would range them such a way. All sadly puffed and bloated she, and big with sudden pain, as if she'd struggled to cry out, to call for help in vain. For as she cried, some higher power must have stopped her lips. The room is pale with moonlight, and through the window flits across the victim's half-shut eyes a single searching gray. Gently, as if to touch a ghostly maid, upon her lower lay. So there is our lovely Maria. Before her stands her knight. He brings her earthly happiness, and does he fear the sight? Dear Maria, art thou then cold and dumb? There is happiness for both us now. Echo answers, none. Maria, darling, 'twas for thee I fought this day. Father will bless our union now. Echoes answers, nay. His tenderest caresses wake no recognition in her eye. Distraught with love, could she but answer with the solace of a sigh? Her head falls limp upon his breast, as lifeless as a stone, and striking there his armor wakes a hollow moan. He shouts, cries out for help, runs through all the empty house, but all is frenzied rushing, only echo serves to rouse. Then back he comes, more hopeful. Mayhap the open air will drive away the heavy gloom that holds the maiden there. But when from off her couch her slender form his strong arm takes, into what fearful motions her stricken body breaks. It knows no pliant suppleness as weighs so lightly down, but from its limp abandon her fate is quickly known. The hanging arms, the lifeless head, the already stiffened feet, all make a fearful sight, yet still to him how sweet. Water, water, cries the knight with loud and crackling cry, and thrusts the massive door aside, his frenzy mounting high. And this is where he meets this truly strange, uncanny creature, this young man, this pachole, it's called in Polish, and we have no idea who he is, what he is, where he comes from. And when I read this many, many times, there's this one analogy that I always seem to draw on. There's this amazing movie called The Brood, in which there's a psychiatrist, and various people's neuroses are brought out to them in physical fashion. They grow these horrible tumors and stuff like that. And one of his patients starts producing these creatures that aren't really children, but they're like children, except they go around killing all of the people who have created these neuroses in her. And I've always thought of this pachole as this kind of this thing that's born. It's not really a child. It's not really human. It seems to be some kind of product of the various unconscious a syndrome or symptom, I should say.
It seems like something that's haunting him.
Exactly.
This character, this sidekick, this page that's going to be following him around forever now.
Perhaps the most famous, although interestingly enough, when there are lists of poems associated with the poets associated with the Ukrainian school, he's usually brought in kind of in the sidelight is Juliusz Słowacki. And Słowacki wrote a continuation of Václav, what Václav does after the end of this poem. Okay, it's typical Słowacki, but I shall leave this for Professor Grabowicz, who I heard is going to be about Słowacki.
We hope so. We have it on the agenda. If all is approved, then
that's all his. That's
then we'll save that for the Słowacki episode.
Exactly.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it does get stranger and stranger. I mean, later on, there's this very bizarre scene where, I mean, first of all, this work, which is, it's a long work. It's sort of 70 some pages or something like that. It observes the unity of time, doesn't it? It takes place within 24 hours, doesn't it? Yeah. So I've got that right. And it's a lot of things happen in 24 hours. I mean, the planned, marriage, and then running off in this terrible battle with the Tatars, which is just absolutely brutal and gruesome. And then he, comes back, and she's already been, you've had somehow, his father has sent the murder party, and they show up in the castle, and they, in the meanwhile, to drown her and bring her back, and then he comes home, and then finds her in this way, and then he rearranges the body. I mean, which I thought was just kind of a surreal moment. Do you want to look at that one too, in part 19 of Canto 2? Where he's rearranging the body.
He carries the lifeless body back to the fateful room. Their misty eyes are guided by fitted rays from the moon. And notice here again, we have that strange anamorphic view. It's that the moon is gazing at them. Rather, the moon is acting upon human beings here. It's fascinating. Dear Václav, for the final time, prepares her poor bride's bed and tries with tender effort, stayed by modesty, to spread her members, hair, and garments in orderly array. For gossips, even death, will find unfriendly things to say. Then with longing glance at face of her whom he has loved so dear, such look as purges grief away, but holds the promise clear of sure reunion. With the attention of despair, he graves his memory deep with sight of Maria lying there, then cuts the air with his glittering sword that whistles fierce and bold, and on whose hilt the grave itself will not relax his hold. Then strides away, his countenance no longer lined and sad. He leaps on a horse and rides away, and with him rides the lad. Who is the youth with weeping eyes who rides with him this night? The spirit of his fate, an angel, Satan, who joins his flight? Will he follow him in misery and share his every pain? Who knows? He clings to the writer as together they skim the plain.
It's a weird moment. I mean, first of all, can you imagine this situation where he's, obviously devastated, and he feels he needs to rearrange her limbs, and then makes this extravagant gesture with his sword. What does that have to do with anything, right? What does that accomplish? Well, we can imagine, right?
He's off to kill his father. I mean,
yeah.
This is one very kind of obvious Freudian way of reading this. This is importantly, it's an Oedipal poem in which the death of Maria triggers a set of realizations on the part of Václav of the world of laws, the world of concepts, the world of what is right, what is wrong, all of this. He suddenly enters manhood, as it were. And part of that, of course, is a challenge to paternal authority, which we assume is going to happen, and which, of course, Słowacki takes literally and goes with it. But in any case, this isn't just the one moment. The poem is full of these very strange and unusual ways of looking at things, or I should say, of things looking at humans. It's as if this whole world is somehow, the translation doesn't really get this across as well as I would hope, but it's full of passages. The original is full of passages of objects. The human being is like the object of non-human phenomena, the moon, the earth, and so forth. All of these things looking and somehow acting upon the humans. Very strange.
Nature personified, which is itself a very romantic trope, right?
I would say it's even more than just personification. What we have here is that nature and immaterial things are actors here. Mm-hmm. They actually work on the humans in this strange way. The other interesting thing, too, is in connection with Byron, is that it's clear on the part of Mieszkowski that he's trying to work out in the Polish language certain concepts, abstract ideas that have not been part of Polish discourse. And you can see him stumbling, trying to, using euphemisms, ellipses, trying different ways of expressing certain ideas that Polish discourse has not yet had an opportunity to develop, whether either philosophically or critically, and so forth. So that also makes it an interesting poem, I think. I know it's very unfashionable to connect, a literary text with an author's biography, but I think in this case, precisely because of the nature of the things that he was practicing, I do think that is one of the reasons why this poem is so strange and so rich, because of the unconscious elements in it, or I should say, the exploration of the unconscious that clearly seems to come out here. But this poem is, to a large degree, an exception to the literature that was being produced about Ukraine before 1830, but particularly after 1830, insofar as Maria exists in this kind of a non-defined space, the one space that is very concrete and very important for all of literature about Ukraine is the image of the steppe. Okay. That's something that runs through all of literature, or the Ukrainian schools, or whatever you want to call all those writers who write about Ukraine. And in some ways, Poland, aside from the Carpathian Mountains, of which, by the way, there is a work about Carpathian, Ukrainian Hutsuls by Korzeniowski. It's also interesting in its own sense, in its own way. But there are no mountains in Ukraine or in Poland, or except for obviously in the Tatars and so forth. But in this part of the Polish-Lithuanian, or the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so the notion of the sublime is very important, as we know, for Romantic literature. And the steppe, I think, plays a very important substitute role as an object of the sublime in its own way for many of these writers. We saw, if we have time, we can quote the little passage from the Castle of Kaniów, where we have a description of Ukraine, but the steppe as this vast, unmarked expanse that, as far as you can see, there is nothing. It's empty, where the land meets the sky, where the human being, and this is a very important aspect of all various notions of the Romantic sublime, is a human being is a very tiny little speck in this vast natural world. Mm-hmm. And this vast natural world at once fascinates, draws the human, and at the same time repels, terrifies. And it's like, it's like very often people talk about the sublime as this beautiful terror, if you will, mm-hmm. something that we can kind of avoid it because it's nature. We can get away from it. But at the same time, it's always there in its massiveness, its hugeness, its universality. Hence, so the steppe plays a very important role. But getting back to the historical topic, most, I would say, works that deal with Ukraine that are written in the first half of the 19th century, in other words, Romanticism, deal in one way or another with the most traumatic, or one of the most traumatic events of relatively recent Polish history, and that's the 1768 Hajdamach uprising and the Polish Confederation revolution that it was tied with, the Confederation of Bar, which leads up to all of this taking place right before and then leading up to the first partition of Poland in 1772. Hence, that 4-year period, 68 to 72, or maybe even earlier, is viewed as this critical moment in which the history of Poland takes a radical, tragic shift in a number of different ways, a number of directions.
And this is in people's memory at the time, as compared with, in our discussion of Sienkiewicz's novel With Fire and Sword, where there's a certain my friend and colleague Stanley Bill argues that Sienkiewicz is feeding nostalgia for Imperial Poland to his audience, something long ago and far away. But this was not long ago and far away for the early Romantics.
First of all, the focus of Sienkiewicz's Fire and Sword, let's say, the other trilogies are also 17th century. The other aspects of the trilogy are also 17th century. But the first one, Fire and Sword, is focused on the Khmelnytsky uprising. And that's a theme or a moment that practically doesn't exist in Polish Romanticism. For some reason, they're not interested in it, even though the story arc is a pretty good one. Here's a Ukrainian petty gentryman whose wife is supposedly stolen by a Polish, his Polish gentry neighbor. This guy Khmelnytsky goes to the king. The king doesn't want to satisfy his complaint, and so he goes to the Cossacks and decides to raise an uprising, which is going to be the first blow to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a great power. But this is just for a number of reasons I'm not going to get into. It just doesn't seem to have interested the Polish Romantics. The 1768 uprising, and whereas for Sienkiewicz, this is the center of his novel. The other aspect of it is that, as you said, the generation of Polish Romantics, their grandparents experienced the moment of 1768. They experienced the trauma of 1768. Hence, the Polish Romantics were able to listen to oral accounts of this event. And there, at precisely this period, a number of memoirs were published of those events of 1768. On top of that, this combination of the Confederacy of Bar, this last gasp of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then the horrific slaughter of the 1768 Haidamак uprising, where the old Polish Ukrainian Commonwealth was seen as slipping away, of no longer being part of this ideal Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, come together, conflate in order to make this moment a fruitful topic for literary treatment, above all, romantic literary treatment. Because I'm going to quote something that I wrote a while back, if you allow me. Okay. Please. What these eyewitness accounts all had in common was a store of requisites that thoroughly resonated with the aesthetic sensibilities of a generation brought up on Shakespeare, Walter Scott, the Gothic novel. What you have is a fortified town set in a lawless, semi-exotic frontier, cruel villains with semi-exotic names, a scheming Orthodox monk, mysterious nocturnal ceremonies, the consecration of knives, a treasonous Cossack retainer who murders ostensibly his own children, an innocent young maiden who, thanks only to her eyebrows, to quote Goszczyński, survives to tell the tale. And of course, you have the carnage itself. And Goszczyński himself describes this whole moment as a theater of blood. And notice he uses the word theater, right? Mm-hmm. This is something to watch. It's a spectacle of blood. And I'll tell you some of the descriptions, both by historians and then by the writers themselves, of the slaughters that occurred in 1768 are pretty horrific, So it works on that frenetic aspect of Polish Romanticism.
So let's take a little look at Goszczyński's Zamek Koniowski.
It's a very convoluted plot. Okay, we really kind of have to really figure out. That's pretty typical of the writing of this time. Remember, again, this is written before the 1830 uprising. Hence, this is the first part of Polish Romanticism, just like Maria is and Zaleski. What we have is a hero, Nebaba, whose love is being blackmailed by the governor of Kaniów to marry him. Otherwise, he will hang her brother. Okay, so that's kind of the background of it. At the same time, Nebaba, who is in some way, he's kind of like one of these brigands from a early 19th century opera. Okay. He's a bit of a, ladies' man, he a very brave, valorous Cossack, right? But a bit of a ladies' man to the point where he seduces a young lady at one point, and that seduction, attempted suicide, and so forth, drives her mad. And she appears throughout the entire story, kind of haunting Nebaba, right?
Right.
And hop, 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 one of those scenes. And Nebaba is not really, and the Haidamaks are about to invade Kaniów, but their leader is not too excited about it. He sits around drinking and so forth. And so Nebaba decides to take advantage of, on the one hand, to conflate the Haidamak attack on Kaniów and to try to rescue his beloved. In the meantime, though, and this is the frenetic part of it, in the meantime, his beloved kills the governor who is trying to seduce her, and there's blood all over the walls. When the Haidamaks finally invade, they see that there's blood everywhere, and the whole thing ends with nearly everybody dead in one way or another. It opens with a great scene of people swinging on the gallows, right? And owls talking to each other. So what we have is this very atmospheric Gothic atmosphere. People obviously saw the influence of French frenetic romanticism on this. And again, what's interesting is that it's precisely the 1768 Hainamak uprising that constitutes the context that helps Gościński build and create this otherwise Gothic frenetic tale on the basis of the cruelties and horrors that happened during the Hainamak uprising. So when they looked for material, for fictional material, they really didn't have to look very far because it was there in history.
This is the originary trauma that's behind the Ukrainian school. So let's look at a couple of passages. We picked one out. So this is a scene of Nababa. Kind of wandering through the landscape.
He crawls up on top of a tree.
Oh, right, yeah.
He crawls up, and by the way, this tree, by the way, makes a reappearance in Mieszkowicz's Pan Tadeusz among very many famous Polish trees when he's defending Polish nature, and this one, Gadula. This tree appears as kind of his Mieszkowicz's homage to Gościński here.
This is a translation. We should acknowledge the other translation. The other translation was by Professor Arthur and Marion Moore Coleman, who Arthur Coleman, I believe, established a Polish program at Columbia, and I think he was the first. And when I was teaching there, I would occasionally find things from his library in the library there that had his name. Sometimes they were just albums of articles that he collected, sometimes his own articles, things like that.
Not a bad translation, by the way.
No, not a bad, and it's the only, the only some of the only translation of the Ukrainian School that we have in English. So for people who want to read, that's out there.
That's out there, right?
Yeah, if you can find it, which is a challenge, but it's there. You have to. I always recommend that people use interlibrary loan, because otherwise libraries will not retain these books.
Good point.
So here we have the only significant translation of the Ukrainian School and Polish Romanticism, and the library might decide, oh, no one's looked at this for 50 years. We can toss it, unless you folks out there, I'm talking to you, my audience, go and request an interlibrary loan and show that that people are interested and that they need it, right, for something.
Or make a scan and pop it online.
Do that too, but you want to make sure we have multiple copies out there, so we don't, so it doesn't get lost. I mean, I think all of us, in the field of Polish literature, experienced, the fact, that moment when we're always going to the library and finding something that no one's checked out for decades.
Sure, yes, absolutely.
But or maybe never. Maybe it's been sitting in the library, since the 1920s or something, and no one's looked at it. But we were thankful that it was there. So I encourage everyone to use the library and request the books. So here's this passage of Nababa, looking down from his tree. What strange land is this that reveals itself to him? There, underfoot on a level plain, Moshna's houses counted with a single glance, the Irdin dozing in the moldy depths, the bulrushes forever grappling with the winds, trees and gardens and groves in the valley. Like green bouquets scattered here and there, There the Dnieper, like a mirror, glistening brightly. Here in the throat of a ravine, sunken as if into a chasm. It hides completely in a gloomy wood. And then it pours out again from the mountain's hips. Yon further, a sandy golden sea. And further still, the wood flows down the peaked summit like the ragged tassel of a landsman. And then even further, further away and closer, mountain upon mountain, the woods and more woods. Villages and hamlet, deserts and forests, gorges and mountains and meadows and sands, tangle and mingle, diverge and converge in thousands of knots, thousands of junctions, like an unreckonable, unruly band. And further, even further, the steppes of sand grow paler, and further, ever further, the forests grow bluer still, and further, ever further, the air grows hazier, the heavens grow lower, and the mist, always the mist. How much rapture, how much freedom will this one prospect unfurl in just 1 hour? Where does this wind blow? Where does this cloud drift? What lands lie yon? Where into the blue mist, streaming eternally, do the Dnieper's waves flow? Let the eagle that circles neath the heavens say, he soars higher and his gaze sees those regions much more clearly. Let him tell of Zaporizhia, how vast is its headman's rule, how endless is their revelry and freedom. The same sun that shines there brightens their scattered bustling barracks, and a herd rushes neighing into the field. And a Zaporizhian on a horse as free as his thoughts races over the meadow. His song is as wild as the gale on the steppe. And there on the Dnieper, a boat slips by, light and agile, as swift as a wave. It flies with the current on a glassy plain. Onto the rapids it fell, tossed about midst the rocks. Down into the depths it sank, disappeared, until far away the water's crystal bursts, and the boat floats like a swan. What was is gone, and what will be will pass. It's a sublime scene of the vastness and impenetrability of the forest, of the ravines. It's the view from above, the eagle eye view. I thought, also interested is the personification of the landscape again, another kind of pathetic fallacy that the mountain is like the Cossack with its ponytail, with his top knot. What's interesting is that it's set in this particular localization, this geographic space, but is drawing on all the tropes of European Romanticism. It's exotic, and it's exotic in a way that that Romanticism permits.
If we have time, it's also worth reading the last 4 or 5 lines of the poem too, because I think it also encapsulates very much this view of Ukraine and this we have in Maria, and one can argue we have it throughout all of the literature that deals with Ukraine, and that this is a land that is somehow cursed, that above, and in Maria we have this vision of a land that is obscenely rich in terms of nature above ground, but one goes a little bit beneath it, and it's a land that is full of bones and dead people and funerals and grave mounds and so forth.
Well, let's read those last lines. And this is also kind of the image, another one of those romantic tropes of the ruined castle, because this is after the Kaniev's castle has been burned to the ground. The years passed by, and with the years what came to pass. In the last haze of an extinguished flame, the demons of destruction have returned to hell. The skies of Ukraine shone through beautifully again. Boldly did a girl's quiet song resound. A year's time has covered the remains of the ruins, where the battlefield turned white with skulls. A torrential storm plows furrows there. On a scorching summer's day, the harvest turns to gold. A flower shyly peeks through there in the spring. The ruins of the gallows glow with rot from the earth. Over the victors, over the vanquished, the grass-strewn grave slowly collapses. A wandering beggar mutters a prayer to sleep. After the war, the gates of hell have closed. Again, the same peace, and again, the same crimes.
That's the beauty of it. That's, again, that this is somehow a land that's cursed. It's always will somehow, there'll always be this kind of some sort of conflict there all the time. And of all these tensions and contradictions of the surface beauty and the horror beneath. And it seems to be a theme that runs throughout. And as a matter of fact, one can argue that there have been a number of, there's one film that I remember called, just recently came out about Ukraine, called Atlantis. Really very, very good film. It's kind of in the future, although it's very prescient since it was made before the war. And it's about a fellow and a woman who work in a team gathering the rotting bodies of soldiers who had died during the Donbass conflict. And again, you see this land that's on the surface, calm, peaceful, but constantly digging up death. And it's almost as if this land is somehow cursed with death and conflict. But very much a theme, I think, for many of these, many of the works that are written about Ukraine, particularly after, about the 1768 Haidamach uprising.
And perhaps why they might suddenly become relevant now.
For sure. Absolutely.
On that note, I'd like to thank you for joining me again and bringing these works back to the surface and giving us a chance to pay a little more attention to them than perhaps we otherwise might.
Well, you're very welcome. It was a joy to be here again. And as you said, it'll be nice if we could have translations of more of these works. Not all of them, but certainly more of them. I think Goszczyński's deserves a translation. There's no question about it. And some of Słowacki's works, as you'll talk about with Grabowicz, some of Słowacki's works also, particularly The Silver Dream of Salome, which is about Ukraine, that too deserves a translation. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate being with you. And it's a great show.
Thanks again.
Really a wonderful series. And I congratulate you on it.
Thanks so much. Wait up. Please subscribe and click the bell to stay on top of the program. Watch the credits for some recommendations about how you can support aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. Use the pause button if it's going by too fast. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. The Polish Cultural Institute New York sponsors our program. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is our executive producer. Natalia Iudin is my fellow producer and editor. Our opening and closing music is by Radek Przedpolski. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month.
Jest to szary dzień, jak zawsze w tej okolicy. Cała sceneria wydaje się chwilami fotografią z ilustrowanej gazety. Tak szare, tak płaskie są domy, ludzie i pojazdy.